Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the complex, the iconic, and the sometimes overwhelming, and break it down into the essential, unforgettable nuggets of knowledge. We don't just summarize the facts, we find the underlying architecture of success.
Today, we are following a spectacular decades-long trail of dots, and I mean literal dots, into the universe of Yayoi Kusama. This is more than just an art history lesson.
Right.
It's a deep examination of how a single, repetitive visual motif born out of this intense personal struggle and hallucination became an entire philosophy.
An art movement, even.
An art movement, and ultimately one of the most powerful and recognizable luxury marketing superpowers the world has ever seen.
And that journey, that's the real story here. The path from a private mental landscape to a global commercial template, that's the tension we really want to unpack.
Exactly.
We're going to be analyzing how raw personal chaos was translated into this profound structural coherence, and critically how that visual system, the dots and the nets, managed to scale infinitely.
All the way up to those Louis Vuitton bags we all recognize.
And the Immersive Museum shows that you literally can't get a ticket for. They sell out everywhere, globally.
So our mission in this deep dive is to give you a shortcut. We want to synthesize this complex, 7-decade-long trajectory of Kusama. We're analyzing the precise mechanism by which she distilled an intense inner vision.
This private world of multiplying shapes.
Yes, into an infinitely repeatable, universally understandable, and frankly, commercially viable visual system.
And to really understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, to a single origin point, a moment the source material describes as truly cinematic.
It really is. We have to imagine we're in Matsumoto, Japan. This is decades before New York, before the galleries, before any of the fame.
And we're watching a young girl, Yayoi Kusama, just staring intently at a field of violets. Her family owned a plant nursery.
And this is the foundational moment, a perceptual experience that completely rewired her understanding of the world. She's standing there, and she recounts how the violets start to flicker. Then they multiply.
And then they start staring back at her.
Exactly. That's when the visual phenomenon begins. The dots appear, and then they just multiply without end. They cover the flowers, they cover the path.
The sky,
her own hands, her body, everything.
She describes this feeling as if the self was dissolving, which sounds terrifying, but she puts it in a very specific way.
Yeah, not just terror. It's this overwhelming sense that, and this is her phrase, every object is part of one endless loop. It's a total sensory saturation.
The boundaries between her, the air, the flowers, it all just collapses.
Right. And, looking back on this now, with all the benefit of hindsight and psychiatric distance, people put all sorts of labels on it.
Of course.
People close to her would later call it a severe hallucination. A psychiatrist might say it's a clear response to early life trauma.
And what about the art historians?
The art historians, seeking a bit of a polite distance perhaps, would label them early perceptual motifs.
A bit more clinical.
A lot more clinical.
Yeah.
But whatever you call it, the experience imprints itself on her like a lifelong watermark. It is the genesis of this entire cosmos. She would spend her life both trying to escape and trying to control.
That overwhelming input.
Yeah.
It required an equally overwhelming output.
Which brings us directly to the next phase. Our section 2, dots as survival and structure, all rooted in her early life in Japan.
So this visual watermark she experienced in the fields, it doesn't just stay in her mind.
Not at all. It moves almost immediately onto paper.
Yeah.
She felt compelled to draw. Her early notebooks became her first studio, and they filled up so fast with these repetitive units.
Circles, nets.
Tiny, meticulous patterns of iteration. And what's so fascinating is that, a lot of children do doodle. But Kusama's practice wasn't casual. It was compulsive.
You can see it in the work.
Oh, absolutely. The shapes didn't stop at the edges of the page. They just kept expanding until they swallowed everything else. If you look at those early sketches now, they have this chilling rigor to them.
It's less like drawing and more like, mapping something?
Exactly. It's like she's mapping an infinite mental landscape. And that rigor, that intensity, it points to the core mechanism we have to understand here. The dots weren't initially an aesthetic choice. They weren't for beauty or style.
They had a purpose, a much more fundamental psychological purpose.
They were, at their core, survival. And this is really our design principle number 1. repetition as a stabilizing device.
Okay, so unpack that.
She was experiencing this raw, unfiltered inner chaos, this constant feeling of sensory overload, of dissolution. She needed a way to translate that chaos into some kind of outer, comprehensible, and this is the key, controlled structure.
So the manual labor of it, drawing thousands of tiny dots, that was the control. If the world was dissolving around her randomly, she could impose her own rigorous self-generative structure back onto it.
Precisely. For Kusama, you could almost say the dot acts as a kind of cosmic bullet journal. It provides coherence to a mind that was constantly perceiving the world as liquid, as unstable.
That's a great way to put it.
For any other artist, repetition is a choice, a style. For her, it was a necessity for her mental equilibrium. The endless net was both the structure holding her together and the visual map of the universe that threatened to consume her.
And it's so different from her Western contemporaries, even before she met them. You think of the abstract expressionists, and it's all about the big, spontaneous gesture.
The quick mark of emotion.
Yeah. And Kusama's work is the polar opposite. It demands this meticulous, slow, controlled, almost painful labor. It's an anti-spontaneity aesthetic.
Totally. She needed the physical act of drawing the unit over and over and over just to ground herself. The time spent drawing hundreds of identical circles provides a rhythm, a predictability.
A kind of visual meditation.
But visual meditation, but one that comes, like you said, with these immediate cosmic implications. This went way beyond just simple craft.
And this intense practice, it ran up against some very real-world logistical constraints.
It did. The sources mentioned she started painting on whatever she could find. Fabric, household furniture, even old clothing. Canvases and good supplies were just too expensive in post-war Japan.
And that financial necessity, it accidentally creates this powerful, almost prophetic design cue.
Some people really do see this practice of painting on, a chair or a table as pure foreshadowing. It suggests she was always destined to spill her art out of the conventional frame.
Out of the rectangle of the canvas.
And turn every single surface in the world, whether it's domestic or later commercial, into a potential artwork.
It really does set the stage for her later work, where entire environments and objects, including handbags and shoes, are just obliterated by her patterns. She turns necessity into a conceptual framework.
But our ambition was never limited by her bank account. By her late teens, she was already highly strategic. She was desperate to escape what she felt was the artistic and personal claustrophobia of her home life.
So she started writing letters.
All over the world. To artists, museums, galleries. She was trying to force her way into the global art conversation from her small town in Japan.
And this leads to that legendary moment where she reaches out to Georgia O'Keeffe, of all people, sends her samples of her work, pleads for advice. The nerve that takes for a young artist in post-war Japan is just astonishing.
It's an incredible move.
Yeah.
Highly calculated. She targeted O'Keeffe specifically. She was a powerful, established female voice operating outside the usual male-dominated art world.
And the crucial thing is, O'Keeffe actually wrote back.
That must have been world-changing for her.
It was everything. O'Keeffe didn't just brush her off. She offered this measured encouragement and advice and essentially told her, if you want to survive as an artist, you need to go where the action is. It's that cinematic moment. The protagonist gets handed the metaphorical plane ticket.
And a validation stamp from one of her heroes. That affirmation was the final catalyst she needed to leave Japan.
But before she leaves, we should probably take a second to contextualize the visual world she was absorbing in Japan. It helps us understand just how radical her later work really was.
Yeah, that's a good point. The Japanese scene at that time was kind of in an identity crisis. It was this chaotic mix of traditional Nihonga painting, Western-style oil painting,
The visible scars of the war.
intense economic rebuilding, and these just scattered fragments of global modernism.
So she was absorbing these huge international shockwaves, Cubism, Surrealism, abstract Expressionism, but only in pieces, right? Like cutting out Picasso reproductions from old newspapers.
Yes, or reading smuggled modernist magazines.
Yeah.
She was piecing together the international avant-garde like a brilliant detective. She internalized these radical ideas of fragmentation and abstraction before she ever set foot in America.
So the isolation actually amplified the ideas.
It created this highly concentrated, incredibly personalized modernism. And that vision manifests in the sheer labor of her practice. We have to just pause on that painful detail for a moment. She would draw hundreds of dots in one sitting until her hand physically cramped. day after day.
It's not just a cute bit of trivia, it's fundamental to her whole methodology.
Exactly. It shows her process wasn't intellectual or spontaneous. It was physical, laborious, and compulsive. And this feeds right into a standing academic debate.
Which is?
Was this obsessive repetition purely therapeutic, a way to cope? Or was it an early, unavoidable manifestation of the lifelong mental compulsions that were just part of her reality?
The difference between art as an idea and art as a physical necessity.
Right. And this brings us to our design principle number 2, the module. The dot, or the net stitch, as this repeatable visual unit that can scale infinitely.
The core building block of her entire system.
She practically worships the iterative unit. And we have to understand the scale here. One dot is just a module, right? Put it on a canvas. It's decoration, a simple pattern.
But if you accumulate 1,000 of them across a room...
Now it's an experience. And if you accumulate millions of them across decades, across every medium imaginable, that is how you build an internationally recognized mythology. That's how you build an aesthetic system.
She built her visual universe like a programmer writes code, one repeating unit at a time, expanding the system until it becomes entirely self-sustaining.
And the dots, they evolve. They go from being a psychological symptom to a language, and then finally into a global phenomenon. And this self-sustaining system, this meticulous internal logic, that's what she packed in her suitcase when she made that heroic, terrifying leap to New York City.
Okay, so let's make that leap with her. We're moving into Section 3, the Crucible, New York, and the avant-garde wars of the 1960s. The sources describe her arrival as something between a leap of faith and a controlled cultural crash.
It was an immediate and profound culture shock. I mean, she arrives in this supercharged environment where the art world is just dominated by abstract expressionists.
It's a very macho, aggressive style.
Totally. Scale and spontaneity were king. Jackson Pollock was still very much the aesthetic benchmark.
And in walks Kusama, armed with her delicate Japanese watercolors and these precise, meticulous infinity nets. You can just imagine the critics and the artists kind of squinting, wondering what on earth this quiet, intensely controlled work was doing there.
And the city itself immediately became what she called her second hallucination. A massive, pulsing organism of noise, competition, and constant, aggressive reinvention. She stepped right into the deep end during a hurricane of artistic movements.
And that intensity, it forced a mutation in her work, right?
Yeah.
She had to go from being this introspective girl drawing her inner visions to a very public artist who sharpened those visions into a confrontational public system.
The city accelerated everything. It had to.
Because the 60s were the ultimate avant-garde wars. You had the minimalists stripping everything back to fight the emotional excess of the abstract expressionists.
Then you had the pop artists turning soup cans into cultural weapons. Performance artists trying to shock the system. It was a battlefield.
And she walks right onto that battlefield carrying her system of repetition and this strange serenity. But the competition was catalytic. It challenged her.
It challenged her scale. If Pollock made action into a spectacle, she made repetition into this hypnotic immersion. If her peers were exploring single objects, she was exploring how to make objects disappear through proliferation.
Let's focus on the infinity nets for a second. These massive monochrome fields weren't just paintings you looked at, they were something else.
They were experiences you stood in front of. Viewers described the feeling as being like falling through a spider web or being swallowed by a slow-moving, meticulous storm. The scale is psychological, not just physical.
How so?
She knew intuitively that if motif repeats enough times, the viewer's eyes stop seeing the individual dot or the unit. You start noticing yourself just sinking into the vastness of the pattern. It's a very subtle form of hypnosis.
And then came the big turning point when she realized she could make that repetition physically inescapable.
Yes. She moves into 3 dimensions with the soft sculptures.
So the repetition literally leaps off the canvas.
It leaves the flat surface entirely. She starts creating these large, strange accumulations. Furniture, boats, shoes, all covered in hundreds of these phallic-shaped, stitched fabric forms. Her studio floor essentially becomes this landscape of multiplying, organic-looking forms.
It's like the dots escaped the canvas and mutated into real, tangible things.
Exactly. And the critical reaction, as you can probably guess, was volatile.
I can imagine.
Critics were confused. They nervously laughed. They whispered about feminist statements because of the shapes. But as the source notes, in the 60s avant-garde, making people uncomfortable was basically the highest form of compliment.
If they're uncomfortable, you're doing something right.
Absolutely. The work moved from an invitation to look to a kind of entrapment. The viewer realizes they're surrounded by this strange, proliferating world. And this is where her radical ideas start clashing with the commercial side of the art world.
Which brings us to the famous macaroni anecdote, the pasta.
Yes, the edible kind. She covered an entire room with dried macaroni, painted it all silver, and reportedly it was a protest against the commercialization and elitism of art prizes.
It's such a classic piece of trivia from that era, high art and low materials colliding.
And it forces that debate. Is this pure satire of art as a consumer product? Is it high absurdity? Or was it just her using the cheapest, most available material to keep her obsessive practice going? She, Grace, rarely gave a simple answer.
She realized that if the avant-garde was a kind of public theater, she could stage her own scenes using her own aesthetic language. And this is when she really dives into performance art.
But not the chaotic body-flinging kind. Hers were meticulous events, constructed entirely around her visual system.
She dressed performers, often nude, in dotted suits, paint their bodies.
And placed them inside environments that were also covered with her repeated forms. These weren't random happenings. They were highly organized, visually shocking rituals. She was redesigning the logic of the happening through her own obsessive cosmic lens.
And this feeds into a huge design knowledge drop, really, about the history of space. Installation art as we know it today owes this massive debt to artists like Kusama.
Oh, for sure. Artists who started treating space itself as a material, not just as a container to put objects in.
It's that crucial conceptual difference between saying, I'm going to put a sculpture in this room, and saying, I'm going to transform the room so thoroughly that just entering it is the artwork.
And during this period, her repetition really moves beyond personal therapy, becomes fully defined conceptual territory,
That's so.
political commentary, psychological architecture, and a concrete visual philosophy of infinity.
And that philosophy is centered around her core phrase, self-obliteration.
This is the key. This is what unlocks the purpose of the dots. When the dots or the nets cover an object or a person, that thing stops being a chair or a boat. It becomes conceptually part of infinity.
So obliteration in her world is actually liberation.
It is. It reduces the entire world to these repeating democratic units until your individuality dissolves into what she called cosmic sameness.
Which, depending on your perspective, is either deeply comforting or existentially terrifying.
Right. But it becomes the seed of her most globally recognizable work. But, the New York scene wasn't all philosophical. It was intensely competitive. Which brings up academic debate number 2, the conflicts she had with her peers.
She was confrontational about it. She famously accused Claes Oldenburg of borrowing ideas from her soft sculptures.
And she maintained that her infinity nets predated certain rigorous minimalist gestures by years. Scholars are still arguing fiercely about this. Was it genuine influence? Was it just a case of great minds think alike at the same time?
Or that polite phrase, collective intuition.
Exactly. The timing is so tight, it's almost impossible to say for sure. But the tension itself confirms she was operating at the absolute cutting edge of the minimalist and pop movements.
New York definitely taught her to be loud and public. She started staging these outdoor performances in iconic locations.
She realized, if the goal is self-obliteration, why stop at the gallery door? Why not dissolve the boundary between art and the city itself?
And the media loved her. Her image, the signature short red hair, the patterned clothes, it all became inseparable from the work itself. This was proto-branding in action.
A really early intuitive realization that the artist's persona needed to be a living, breathing extension of the artwork, ready for mass consumption.
There's also that curious fact about her writing during this time. She wrote these poetic, sometimes confrontational letters to newspapers, even the U.S. government, urging for peace.
It highlights this powerful duality in her. On one hand, her art is designed to dissolve boundaries, to create a kind of chaos, to achieve infinity. But her writing was trying to rebuild stability, pleading for a calmer, more coherent world.
So as this pivotal section closes, the big takeaway is that she entered New York with this private world of shapes.
And she walked out having forged a public, aggressive visual vocabulary, a system powerful enough to withstand and often lead the noise of an entire era. Her work was no longer just personal. It became a system the whole world could potentially enter.
And that system was about to find its ultimate physical form, the infinity mirror rooms.
The breakthrough.
Which brings us to section 4, the breakthrough. Infinity mirror rooms. This is really where her central argument achieves its final spectacular form. Repetition moves off the surface of a canvas and becomes the entire space.
It's the ultimate spatial transformation. She took the inward logic of her childhood hallucination and turned it into a physical, shared environment for other people.
People often think of infinity as, a concept or a number. She treated it like a tangible room you can walk into for 60 seconds.
Exactly. The mirrors and the repetitive units, they allow this very finite small box to make a very convincing argument for the infinite.
And this transition, it taps right into our design principle number 3, experience as form. She basically pioneered the template for immersive experience long before that became a marketing buzzword for every museum.
She didn't set out to build entertainment. She was building something intuitive, psychological, and hypnotic. She was creating these environments decades before museums were dedicating entire wings to participatory art.
She's an accidental futurist in that sense.
Totally. The source material has that great line. If social media existed when the first Infinity Mirror Room opened, the images would have instantly gone viral and melted every server in New York.
It's so true. The visual impact is just immediate and so potent. But we have to emphasize the great irony here is that these rooms were absolutely not created to be photo opportunities.
No, they were designed as psychological environments for the self to fully dissolve. It was obliteration made tangible, accessible, and brightly lit.
The mirrors are the medium. They collaborate with physics, with light and reflection to make this visual argument about universal repetition and infinity.
But for all the mathematical rigor of the mirrored structure, they aren't cold or academic. Visitors consistently describe entering them and feeling this profound, otherworldly calm.
So the repetition that once threatened to overwhelm and destroy her
becomes the very method used to comfort millions of people. The symptom became the story, and the story became the architecture of liberation. It's an incredible transformation.
And this is where the sublime meets the mundane, which I just love. The detail that Kusama created one of her earliest, most famous mirror rooms using hundreds of tiny Christmas lights she bought at a hardware store.
The profound, the sublime, the infinite, it all starts in the discount lighting aisle. It just proves that she treats everyday, consumer-grade materials as perfectly valid portals to another dimension. Anything in her system can be transformed.
So by the mid-60s, these rooms are drawing attention far beyond the usual avant-garde critics.
Oh, yeah. Museum goers who were expecting to see static paintings on a wall suddenly found themselves being swallowed by these environmental illusions. She was bridging that gap between high concept and mass appeal.
And this is such a crucial point for understanding her commercial success later on. She built an early analog prototype for what we now just call experiential design.
She had this profound, intuitive understanding that audiences crave more than just looking at art from a distance. They want to inhabit it, to be placed inside the core idea.
And she understood that the viewer is the ultimate medium in the room.
Exactly. The room doesn't just show you infinity, it physically forces you to complete the illusion with your own reflection. Without a body inside, it's just an empty mirrored box. It's incomplete.
And this relentless consistency over decades, the dots, the mirrors, the soft sculptures, it starts to function like a unified identity system.
She wasn't deliberately trying to build a brand in the modern sense, but she organically achieved this distinct, repeatable, and instantly recognizable visual style. You could never confuse her work with anyone else's.
And that consistency, it's rooted in her philosophy, not in superficial marketing. Repetition isn't her trademark, it's her worldview. Infinity isn't an aesthetic choice, it's existential.
She's trying to build a working model of the cosmos, not just sell posters. But there is a shadow we have to acknowledge here, the dark irony of their creation.
Which is?
The Infinity Mirror Rooms, for all their dazzling light and beauty, emerged during some of her darkest emotional periods. Profound struggles with anxiety and depression after her initial fame and all the competitive pressure of New York.
So they were basically structural havens she built to protect herself against her own internal chaos.
Yes, and the fact that these intensely personal defensive structures later became sites of mass market joy and shared experience for millions, that's a profoundly human and deeply poignant irony.
There's also that anecdote about radical intimacy, a mirrored chamber she designed for a single viewer at a time.
Which is such a radical rejection of art as a public communal spectacle.
So what was the thinking there? Was she responding to the overwhelming social pressure by forcing solitude? Or was she trying to heighten the psychological experience of seeing yourself multiply beyond your control?
I think it's both, which is why it works so well. It really dramatizes that moment of self-dissolution. But either way, her whole system of infinite iteration resonates perfectly with later digital aesthetics.
You mean like fractal virtual environments, generative art.
VR, even the visual culture of old screensavers. She essentially built analog VR decades early just using mirrors and light bulbs instead of pixels and code. Technology later had to adapt to her visual code, not the other way around.
So this whole shift from avant-garde experimentalist to a visionary of these intensely engaging experiences, that's the bridge to the final evolution.
The collision with commerce. The experience of immersive infinity, which was once radical, became instantly desirable and infinitely shareable.
And brands who are desperately hungry for emotional storytelling and visually compelling, recognizable systems.
They would eventually look at her consistent, repeatable visual language and see a portal into a completely new kind of collaboration.
Which leads us directly into our final section, Section V, the collision art, luxury, and enduring influence. After she returns to Japan, the narrative shifts and global fashion starts to recognize the power of the dots.
It starts pretty informally in the late 70s and 80s, focused on fabrics, patterns, costumes for local projects. But the dots are now a fully realized visual vocabulary. They instantly signal a signature style.
And this is the key design principle that commerce latches onto, pattern as identity.
Exactly. The dot stopped being just a decoration. It became an immediate form of intellectual property.
And she was already playing with the idea of wearable art, translating that obliteration concept onto the human body. There's that early example of her designing stage costumes for a local Japanese theater troupe.
Yes. The budget was tiny, the materials were humble, but she turned each garment into a mobile infinity space. The stage effectively becomes a moving installation. The performers become walking environments.
It crystallizes that idea of art on the move. The wearer becomes part of the bigger conceptual system.
And the pivotal moment, of course, is the Louis Vuitton partnership. That's what elevated her work to the highest echelon of global commerce. Why was that such a perfect fit?
Well, LV recognized that the dots weren't just a pattern. They were a deep, established narrative and a commercial magnet. They're instantly recognizable, emotionally resonant, and incredibly flexible across all their products.
Luxury thrives on telling stories of vision, of struggle, of persistence. Kusama's dots carry all of that weight.
It turns a very expensive handbag from just a consumer item into a portable narrative device, a physical, usable piece of her artistic universe.
And here's the fantastic cold trivia from that first LV collaboration. Her insistence that the dots on the leather goods had to be arranged to create movement and depth, not just a flat decorative pattern.
That must have been a production nightmare for a company that's all about precision and standardized patterns.
It was. The production team reportedly panicked. They had never worked with an artist who treated a standard product surface like a kinetic sculpture that had to argue for infinity.
The result was commercially magical, but it immediately launched our academic debate number 3.
Was this selling out? Was she cheapening the radical purity of her early work? Or was she democratizing art by making the aesthetic experience available outside of a gallery?
And that tension between purity and accessibility is still unresolved, but it's also what fueled the collaboration's immense success.
Which brings us to that incredible specific detail about her intervention in the product design. The cosmic heel anecdote.
This is one of my favorite details. It just proves her conceptual rigor never stopped.
She insisted a shoe heel be painted with dots specifically, so the wearer can feel infinite when stepping.
That sounds like a design brief straight out of a philosophy class, not a fashion house.
The engineering team, dealing with structural integrity in mass production, probably raised an eyebrow, but she won the argument. And it shows her meticulous attention to scale, repetition, and the desired effect on the human body, even in a tiny structural detail.
It confirms that her immersive approach extends right down to the person carrying the bag or wearing the shoe.
And her collaborations went way beyond just simple product placement. They evolved into experiential retail itself, pop-up exhibitions that blended a gallery, a store, and pure spectacle.
So shoppers weren't just buying something, they were entering a small-scale pop-up infinity room designed specifically to house the products.
It creates this hybrid aesthetic where the art becomes the commerce, and the commerce becomes a highly desirable, shareable art experience. It created an entirely new retail category.
This phenomenon also gives rise to a really powerful technical concept, transmedia spatial thinking.
That's the nerdy design insight that explains why her system is so successful. Kusama manipulates dot size, density, and spacing on a small object, like a mini purse, to evoke the exact same perceptual logic as a full immersive room.
So she ensures her visual language translates seamlessly and conceptually across every scale, every medium, from a canvas to a sculpture to a mass-produced handbag.
The logic of the system is always the same. The only thing that changes is the stage.
And this commitment to experience over just possession is highlighted by that rare fact that some of her fashion pieces were displayed in museums before they even hit stores.
Right, and visitors were often allowed to try on the garments inside custom mirrored installations.
She wanted them to experience the art, not just own the object.
Exactly. And that approach predicted contemporary luxury retail strategies perfectly. Consumers now seek interaction, immersion, and shareable social media moments over mere material ownership. The value is in the story and the interaction.
And ultimately, the dots function as metaphors for both the self and the universe, the microcosm and the macrocosm. And that duality is what allows them to carry so much existential weight, even on a commercial product.
That philosophical core is the firewall. It prevents the commercial collaborations from feeling cynical or just decorative. And to her immense credit, she personally oversaw the scale and placement of practically every dot in many of these projects. She ensured absolute fidelity to her principles.
So her contemporary ripple effect is just enormous. It's everywhere. Experiential installations in museums, commercial design in hotels, and it's so clearly present in digital aesthetics like VR and generative art.
She built the analog template for infinite iteration, and the digital world has basically been following her lead ever since. And of course, you have the giant polka dot pumpkin sculpture becoming a global cultural meme.
The hashtag infinite pumpkin.
The blurring of sculpture performance and internet meme, it just confirms the resilience and adaptability of her system.
So as this section closes, she's achieved something truly unique in art history. She's become a designer of perception itself. Whether it's through a dim, mirrored room or a bright leather handbag, her work operates on all these levels at once: aesthetic, psychological, and commercial.
She proved that the most radical avant-garde concepts can travel beyond the gallery walls and right into the bloodstream of global culture without losing their core conceptual essence. The chaos of her youth became the system that organized global desire.
Which brings us to our section 6, conclusion and final thought. If we summarize this immense 7-decade journey, what are the 3 key stages we should really hang on to?
I think we need to remember the journey moved from, 1, this profound personal obsession and hallucination in her hometown, Matsumoto, then 2, the intense avant-garde crucible in New York with the groundbreaking infinity rooms.
And finally?
And finally, number 3, the globally adopted commercial template that we see in luxury brands and museums today. She went from just documenting her private visions to actively designing public perception.
And that enduring tension remains, right? That debate among scholars about the balance between the radical purity of her early work and the immense accessibility and commercial success of her later collaborations.
Oh, absolutely. And that ambiguity, the fact that the work simultaneously suggests existential dissolution and hyper-commercial visibility, is precisely why she thrives in both worlds.
She's the master of merging intense personal trauma with total global visibility.
And turning minimal units into infinite systems.
So what does this all mean for us? What's the final provocative closing thought we should take away from this deep dive into the system of Yayoi Kusama?
I think the trajectory, it wasn't chaotic or random. I think it was inevitable. The dots had to cross fully into commercial and public space. They had to achieve this level of total immersive visibility.
Because the core logic of her entire system, repetition, accumulation, and immersive environments, it literally demanded it. When you build a system that is designed for infinity, you can't just limit it to a canvas. Luxury, experiential retail, and global branding. At the end of the day, they're just the largest, most visible stages currently available for infinity to perform on.